George Salines' daughter, Lola, was one of the 90 victims who died in the Bataclan attack in Paris in 2015.
Well, since then, George has formed an extraordinary bond with the father of one of the terrorists responsible for his daughter's death. Well, a quite remarkable story, and George joins us now from Paris. George, it's a remarkable story of the power of forgiveness, of the power of the human spirit, but also two men who had a shared experience of terrible grief. In your case, your poor daughter, who was killed by terrorists, but in this other man's case, a son that he tried to save, failed to save him from this nefarious life he'd chosen to lead, and then also lost his son. Tell us about how you came to be friends together.
Actually, it was Asdin who sent me a message 3 years ago. I was at the time the chairperson of victims organization in France that I founded. And he told me that he felt himself like a victim and he wanted to share his grief with me and talk about our mutual experience. I have to admit I was a little bit surprised and even worried, but I had already met some mothers of jihadists, and I knew that those parents were suffering, and I really had no reason to treat Asdin as a guilty man simply because his son had done such terrible things.
Well, it's so interesting you say that because, of course, his son was responsible for the death of your daughter, and people might think you would be rightly furious with him as the father of a terrorist who took away your most beloved, your child. Did you feel anger towards him at any point? Did you have to fight to hold him responsible for the actions of his son?
No, actually, I listened to him, and I listened. I met also his wife. We had several discussions, and it's very difficult to pinpoint in the raising, in the education he gave his son Sammy any obvious mistake that could explain why his son became a terrorist, you know. It doesn't fit the cliché of jihadist parent. And really, Asdin himself feels has a sense of guilt, but he cannot identify what he should have done differently.
Yes.
And George, your daughter Lola, she'd gone to see one of her favourite bands, Eagles of Death Metal. No young woman should ever go to a pop concert, a rock concert, and die at the hands of terrorists. It must have been, I imagine, the worst moment of your life when you heard what had happened. But tell us about your daughter.
Yes, my daughter was a very lively and joyous young woman, very generous, very caring. She had lots of friends. She enjoyed life very much. She was working for a book publishing company in the sector of children and young adults books, and she loved her job.
One of the most striking things to me that you said about the father of one of the terrorists who killed your daughter is that he himself was very much opposed to fundamentalists, to radicalism. He's a Muslim, but had a very tolerant position of religion. That must have struck you, I guess, as a powerful message, if you like, that, you know, the Muslim life, Muslim existence, being a Muslim does not mean you have to attach yourself to fundamentalism, to radicalism.
Of course not. There are 6 million Muslims in France, and terrorists are very rare, fortunately. And I think a major mistake in our fight against terrorism would be to push all Muslims in the same corner with terrorists. If we did that, we would facilitate the job of bad people who want to recruit new soldiers for jihad. It's very important to be inclusive, to talk to Muslims, and it's one of the reasons I accepted to do this book, and is to show an example of dialogue. And if I can speak with Asdin Amimour, I think any French person can speak with his Muslim neighbor.
George, interestingly, I think, and shockingly in many ways, you showed extraordinary forgiveness to this man who was not guilty of what his son did. He's denounced it as much as anybody else. You yourself then became the victim of abuse and a backlash and intolerance, the very kind of intolerance that, you know, really has led to what this terrorist had done.
Yes, I received my share of hate mail, but I have to say, since the publication of this book, most of the reactions I have got are very supportive from my family, from my friends, from my fellow victims, and people are quite interested by this enterprise.
It's an amazing story. The final chapter of the book ends with 2 letters, one by you and one by the father of the terrorist who killed your daughter. He begs for your daughter's forgiveness 1,000 times. He blames her death on a murderous ideology. So those who've committed these horrors have not served Islam, they defiled it. He also talks about his grief. I wonder why, without being able to find answers, have I failed in my role as a father? In your letter, very heartbreaking letter, you simply ask that man's son who killed your daughter, why? This question has occupied me since November the 13th. Why you and your accomplices committed these atrocious crimes. Have you, George, throughout this whole process, have you been able to get anywhere nearer to that answer to that question of why?
Yes, in part, and it was also a very important motivation for me to do this work, because, you know, I participate in an effort of preventative actions. I go in schools, in high schools, talking to children and to young Muslims, and we discuss about violence and extremism. And it's important for me to understand how is it possible that a young person decide to kill people his own age for this ideology. But of course, there remains a part of mystery, because we can identify some risk factors, if you want, but not all youngsters with the same risk factors end up killing so many people.